So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar in conjunction with EY on how to thrive in this disrupted world. Never has this been more prevalent than in these uncertain economic times, with Brexit fast approaching and of course the constant uncertainty around COVID-19. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we live in a city of opportunity with incredible potential for growth and development. Over the past year or so, we've worked in collaboration with various stakeholders to identify those opportunities. In fact, in our submission to the Waterford City and County Development Plan, which we just lodged yesterday, we identify what needs to be done to ensure Waterford's future as the capital of the Southeast. We need to lead by example here, and to do that, we need critical changes in the development plan that will facilitate the changes necessary to develop our city and drive the region. We prepared this document together with Fiora Harrington and partners in conjunction with you, our members. So it very much reflects what you yourselves have identified. In addition to that, we also worked with RICOM and WIT over the last 12 months to produce a City of Opportunity research document, which clearly outlines the opportunities for our city, particularly as we look to attract development and FDI. Waterford is the capital of a region of scale with 604,000 people within an hour's drive time of the city. That makes us a very attractive proposition to national and international companies. And we need at this time a development plan which will facilitate them. Yeah, we are behind other cities in terms of development and economic stability, but I believe that's where the opportunity lies, and we must grasp that in both hands. There is uncertainty in these times, but with that comes opportunity for change, and hopefully today's session will be part of that conversation. Our moderator for today's session is Brian Devereux. Brian is a director of the Chamber and also a director here with EY in Waterford. And Brian is joined by Neil Gibson, who's EY's chief economist, and Simon McAllister, EY's Brexit lead. So thank you for your time today, and I'll hand you over to Brian now to begin today's webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks Gerald for the kind introductions and for the opportunity to speak at today's session. First of all, I'd like to thank Gerald and his team for the fantastic work that they've been doing, especially since mid-March. They've done a great job and are a prime example of how businesses have had to adapt to new ways of delivering their services over the past 6 months. We're delighted to be on this webcast today. For those of you who may not know us, EY is part of the wider national and global EY network. The Waterford office employs about 90 people and provides support to clients across a breadth of professional services such as audit, tax, people advisory, company secretarial and transaction support, amongst many others. It's certainly a timely session, and there's plenty of political activity going on globally, giving Neil and Simon lots to talk about. As Gerald said, Neil Gibson is EY's chief economist in Ireland, and Neil provides economic advice, commentary and modelling input across various business service lines. Simon is a strategy and transactions partner in EY and leads our Brexit response on the island of Ireland. We're seeing a lot of posturing going on at the moment as our new government comes to terms with the reality of keeping the economy up and running. To the east, Boris and co are ruffling the feathers in Europe. And to the west, many of us will be watching as the election campaign develops in the US. One thing is for certain, and that is the economic landscape will continue to change and business must continue to adapt or risk getting left behind. With that, I'm very interested to hear what this all means for Ireland and in particular the Southeast. So I will hand you over to Neil to kick us off with an update on the economy, followed by Simon with an update on Brexit.
Thank you very much, Brian and Gerald, for those introductions, and lovely to be with you all. I've been very fortunate to have a number of trips to Waterford in my role as chief economist, various dinners and functions, speaking to some of you that are on the call today. And I'm sorry that we're not able to do this in person. Much as we've all adapted to this new technological way of working, I still think it's hard to beat being in the same place, being able to discuss and share ideas and think about how we deliver the sort of future that we would all be proud of. So it's a great privilege to be with my friends in the Southeast again. I'm joining you from the sunny climes of Belfast. And I'll be taking you through a little flavour of what's happening in the economy. And you'll be pleased to know just a few slides for you to set the scene. I'll share my screen to do that. And I think what I want to try and do is give you that sense of where the opportunity might be in what is clearly a very difficult time. I could spend a lot of time telling you how difficult some of the challenges are and some of the problems that we're facing, but I'm not sure how far that would take us today. And so what I'm going to really look at is 6 kind of key themes. How the economy's been disrupted, the good news about the recovery that we're all beginning to enjoy, albeit a little bit piecemeal, the fact that this disruption has hit almost every sector of business, every place, every household, and that in itself presents a few opportunities. And then you're going to have heard a lot of commentary about how the world has changed. A digital world, a world of working from home, a world less based on being in big offices and rubbing shoulders with each other, something more disparate and more technologically enabled. Just how much of that will really stay and how much of that could be something that Waterford and the wider Southeast could benefit from. And then what lessons can we take from this? And can we really have any precision about what the future is going to look like? And then I'll hand you over to Simon to talk about Brexit. So lots of numbers. We could all fixate on the economic data that's out there. But the mood music has been, after Q2 of 2020, that some of the hardest hit economies have contracted by about 20%. And some of the more modest were in the sort of 10% range until the Irish numbers came out this week, blowing all of those figures out of the water with a contraction of just 6% in the quarter. Now, I say just, advisedly, that's still the biggest contraction on record in a quarter, but much more impressive than those other regions. And that might lead you to think, well, Ireland has been insulated by its large international sector, and therefore COVID hasn't been quite as disruptive as it has been elsewhere on the continent. And that wouldn't be fully true. There certainly has been a cushioning from that global sector, and that certainly will mean the government has a little bit more money in its coffers than it would have had those sectors not been there. But if we look at the domestic disruption, it's been very similar across almost every market. You may have seen the detailed figures showing that Ireland's domestic economy contracted by about 15 to 18%, depending on the measure you use. And that would be very similar to the contraction domestically in the UK. So although we've seen some insulation there, we've still seen some of that level of disruption. And many of you will have seen that or experienced it in your own businesses or families with restaurants, sports, culture, arts, leisure, maybe some factories, production, construction that wasn't able to operate at the same pace during Q2 due to restrictions on health restrictions or social distancing. Of course, we've seen some good news. You know, glibly, I've put up sort of Netflix and Amazon. Other brands are available, of course, in terms of their subscriber numbers. But being at home has led us to shop differently, to purchase things in a different way. And that's now creating a huge demand for filling in new content for media suppliers or providing new technologically enabled ways to deliver our goods and services. And in many ways, that journey is becoming place agnostic. We don't necessarily need to be rubbing shoulders physically with some of our clients and other colleagues. Well, actually, we just need to be able to connect digitally. And that really brings us back to something I've spoken about on all previous occasions to your area, which is where this concept of the quality of life, the type of living and lifestyle you can enjoy, becomes a very important part of the economic development narrative, not the list of who else is based in that location. So as I mentioned, the Irish data really did exceed expectations. I've taken the UK as a comparator, and I just wanted to draw out that factor that although the quarterly contrast is striking at the headline level, the consumption, that's the money that you or I spend, is actually a very similar level of contraction in the two economies. A small technical point, I'm sorry, this is a very technical and esoteric point, but you might be surprised to see that the Irish government spending has gone up, whereas it's fallen in the UK. That is purely a measurement issue. The UK don't count real growth in public services when schools are closed or when the number of operations being carried out has decreased. That's not the same method used in Ireland. And if we look at the nominal spending, the cash spent on services or on wages, for example, they're very similar. A long way of saying, think of the two domestic economies as similarly disrupted. Where Ireland has clearly performed better has been in this export journey, with it, the fact that if you were going to go into a COVID pandemic and you only had 3 manufacturing industries, you couldn't have picked a better collection than pharma, ICT, or technical goods, and agri-food. So we had a quite a good composition. We didn't have the transport equipment or the car manufacturing or heavy engineering in the same way that the UK would have had. So a very domestically challenged economy, but the good news is we're into recovery mode. At the peak of the disruption, Ireland had a frankly staggering almost 1 million people out of a workforce of 2.1 million in some form of government support that either lost their job, they were in a wage subsidy scheme, or the pandemic unemployment scheme, PUP as it's known. And that has come down quite significantly. The numbers coming down to under 500,000 in that level of disruption, suggesting that many of those people who had lost their job originally have now found their way back into the labour market in some way as our shops and our restaurants begin to reopen. Still a long way to go, but it has been a fairly steady period of improvement. Where we haven't seen the changes on the wage subsidy scheme, which is a good thing. The wage subsidy scheme is still there to provide support to those firms who are still disrupted. It's actually in some ways a better scheme and more similar to French or German counterparts than it is in the UK, which is a furloughing scheme, which means you're paid if you're not in work, although you can now avail of that scheme even if you're working part-time. Whereas in Ireland, it's a subsidy scheme topping up wages for those in sectors that are very disrupted. You're going to see a lot of pressure to keep some of this type of support going, but be under no illusions just how expensive this level of government support has been. Ireland, because of its impressive tax performance, will be a little bit less in debt than perhaps many of its European rivals, but it has still been an expensive journey for public policy. And this chart really shows at the peak of the disruption in April-May time, what sectors had fallen into wage subsidy or pandemic unemployment. And yes, we can see that accommodation and food, our tourism sector, if you will, has been one of the biggest affected. But you might be surprised to see how much in industry or admin or professional services, even the healthcare sector, were falling into these forms of government support. Meaning we've seen a level of disruption almost everywhere. And that means two things for us in a Southeast and Waterford context. It means that the government has a very long list of firms, industries, sectors and places at its door asking for further support and help. And it also means that very few families have been untouched by this crisis. And that has real behavioural impacts on how comfortable people feel going back and spending. You will have seen the schemes throughout the developed world on getting out to spend again, unlocking that cash savings back into the economy to get us going again. But that's really tempered if people have experienced job loss or are feeling very nervous about their employment characteristics. So that desire to get money coming out of consumers' wallets or out of their bank accounts to replace some of the government spending that may be slowing, that's going to be quite a difficult journey with this level of disruption, and likely means we're going to continue to need some government support until that private sector consumers and businesses can feel fully back to quote unquote normal. And the estimates of how many people are on these subsidy schemes varies. It's about between a fifth and a quarter of the labour market by our estimates. We don't have detailed labour market data for each county or local area in Ireland, so we produce that ourselves. And you can see Waterford sitting sort of neatly in the middle there. There's not as obvious a pattern as you might expect. Some of the higher levels of disruption could be seen to be said to be in a lot of tourist areas, Donegal, Kerry, but there are others, Kilkenny, maybe not in the same pattern, partly to do with more a staycation, vacation, or second home place. You can also see the cities slotting in there somewhere in the middle. Cork rather at the lower end, again, partly speaking to very strong pharma and agri-food presence, and places like Carlow and Monaghan at the highest level of disruption. So the improvement has been significant in Waterford, but you're in the pack somewhere. You're not an outlier in either end of the spectrum. But that still means a quarter or a fifth of your labour market are currently under some form of direct government support. That's still a significant level of economic disruption. Now, we have seen some real changes in the way we work and the way we live, but I don't want us to get too hasty about just how fundamentally different the world is, because sometimes we can make decisions or make judgment calls in the eye of the storm. You'll remember the stories after 9/11 of people saying they would never fly again. So will we never be in an office again? Let's see. The data tells us that we're spending about 5% more time in Waterford, according to Google mobility trends, than we used to prior to COVID. We're spending 84% more in the park, which is an interesting change of events, and spending a lot less time in our workplaces. And all evidence suggests that whilst we will return to our workplaces, they may look and feel very different. And in fact, we'll want a combination of a little bit more time at home, a little bit more time in the fresh air, and a little bit of time in work. And think of the things that a place like Waterford could do to facilitate this. Certainly when I was there and staying over, it was a lovely place to go for a walk in the evening before the conference the next morning. Think of the way you can facilitate walks, trails, bike rides, things that you can do to provide this kind of flexible working environment where people are starting at different times, going for a break in the afternoon. Lots of things we can do to make that part of the way we think about the working environment. That's incumbent on a lot of employers to think about how to facilitate that. We spent a lot more time during the lockdown watching TV, eating junk food, and smoking. I can't possibly condone any of those activities, although those who can see me on the screen will know that I embraced the junk food and sweets very much so. We also started to shop online, but 51% of, during the lockdown, of sales coming through that online platform for retail stores, falling sharply down to about 8 now up from 4. And that's to make the point that people will do things under adverse conditions, but there may be some things that they missed. And we see in the survey evidence just how much people's missing on previous activities is beginning to escalate now the longer these conditions go on. See how people feel about a holiday or being back in the office after a long, cold winter at their desk, in their attic or in their study, wherever they might be. And you can see people's attitudes changing, reacting badly to future lockdown plans because they feel they need to have the social interaction. For me, a lot of my job comes from accidental conversations, from the inspiration, the humor, the things that you get in an office environment that are difficult to do in a Zoom setting. We're missing our sport, our culture, our leisure, things that made life what it was for us. So I would say we will be embracing many of those things again when it's safe to do so, not reverting to the world as it was before, but presenting new opportunities around this, if you like, more hybrid model that allows for greater flexibility, greater nimbleness. So we have learned valuable lessons. We have seen firms doing very, very well on the digital side, on the local produce side. We've seen citizens asking more and more about wanting to know, is their spending supporting the local economy? Are they safe in the knowledge that this purchase from the farm shop or from the local store or restaurant is providing economic opportunity for those friends and family members who they've heard about being disrupted by COVID? So there's a real chance to embrace that sense of localism. We've had a policy initiative that's been swift and significant. And what we have to do is think about how we narrate our policy asks in a way that says we can be a platform for better with the right incentives. We're not asking for funding, we're asking for investment. We're seeing a lot of firms saying we need multi-nodal approaches. I can't put all my eggs in one basket, give me different locations. We're going to work, shop, and live differently, each one of those presenting opportunities. People looking for the most commonly searched items on property search engines are now a garden, a study, a little bit more space. These have now moved ahead of things like the quality of the local school. Will that last? Perhaps not. But for now, there's a fabulous window to be able to show people what type of lifestyle can be lived from the southeast, even if the actual employment opportunity is not even in the shores of Ireland. A real time for people to think about being near to home, close to nature, and living a sort of lifestyle that fits this new biosecure, nimble, fitter, fresher, faster, and greener world. So the stuff we've talked about before about having quality of life, quality of living, well-being, quality of public services, quality of education, as all part of that mix of what makes a place special. No longer that packed in, close beside each other, commute, tight urban environment. That's not the only show in town now for the type of lifestyle that people would want to live. And to tee up Simon, really, we have to be clear that they aren't the only problem. COVID isn't the only challenge we've got to fight. We recognise the environmental agenda that's gathering further weight, a crisis of much bigger scale than COVID will ever be, but perhaps not as immediate or not feeling as immediate to many of us as perhaps it should. The quality of life, the fairness argument. You're going to see a lot of people saying, well, Ireland may be the least impacted in a European sense, but I don't feel it in my local area. Let's be clear, Ireland decided to change its government despite being Europe's fastest growing economy. That tells us that the indicators we read, the dashboard, if you will, isn't telling the same indicators that many of our citizens are feeling. We're still dealing with social inequality. We still have some challenges around the profile of Ireland's tax base, and clearly the one that Simon's going to pick up, we have Brexit looming, a further level of disruption. You may have seen recently, this week, there have been forecasts out saying that Ireland's contraction may only be 2%. Now, our own view is that it will still be a pretty significant contraction in the 10% range. Maybe it'll come out a little bit better than that, 6-7%. But on the domestic account, it's going to be as tough as we expected, and we're still going to see some job loss coming through later in the year. So it is a difficult environment, and that's going to make it quite hard to find some of those job opportunities that maybe we had before this crisis began. But let me just finish with a few remarks from me. We're going to have to ensure sufficient capacity is in the economy when the bounce back is available. That means keeping firms open as best as we can, but not by simply providing them with funding to do so, but maybe providing some of the support to make the capital investment to make their business socially distanced, or to provide them a little bit of funding to help them pivot into an online or a more digital world. We have more disruption coming through as the government's funding begins to fade away. It's committed to its capital programme. It's committed to not a new journey of austerity, but that doesn't mean it has a bottomless pit. It's going to be a lot of self-solving. What do you need to do as a local area? And what way will that mean that if we fund this now, we will need to provide less funding in the future? I'm afraid I think the medium-term journey for an island such as Ireland, and indeed many other countries, is one more focused on finding new ways to raise revenue than it is to cut spending. I do not think an austerity journey is electable at all, and therefore we're more likely to be talking about tax. My personal view is that's likely to be wealth, consumption, and behaviourally focused, but we can pick that up in questions if you want to talk about it. In terms of that regional agenda, it's always, and we've said this before, it's running the race you can win. It's being the unique place that you are. Is that a quality of life, a lifestyle, a connectivity? What journey is yours particularly? What's the unique type of housing and lifestyle you can live there? That's what tells Waterford and the South East's journey. Not to say we can compete with X or Y, we can be the best Waterford that we can be. And that will be a unique sell to a number of types of firms and a number of entrepreneurs. If that means getting people to come back and live there and commute digitally to other parts, that's fine. Get that spending in and then start to capture that in terms of some of the other offerings in the area. Tell your stories of success, and we're asking for money. Ask for it in the, here's the brilliant future we will deliver with this funding, not here's the scale of the problem we're asking you to fund. That's not the way to capture imagination at the moment. It's what problem can you solve for me? I think we are going to have a pretty tight budgetary situation, and that's going to mean things like, if you're asking for money, ask yourself the question, would you borrow it yourself if you could? Would you allow yourself to pay more tax in the future to be given money up front to invest in local services? Those are the tough questions that are going to be asked at central government level. So really selling that story of the economic future and some of those green, fitter, faster, more nimble characteristics that I mentioned. So perhaps now, in a reversal of the alphabet, C is beginning to make way for B. COVID is hopefully not going to come back with the same ferocity as it did before. Yes, it's going to leave scars, but hopefully we're going to continue this recovery phase. We're now going to enter the difficult period of Brexit negotiations, which is going to bring another challenge to us all. And for that, I'm going to hand you over to Simon. Thank you very much indeed. I fear Simon may still be on mute, which is the thing that we all dread on Zoom calls. Either next slide, please, or you're on mute. So having done a little bit of filler, I will now do my handover again. Simon, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, it's like the soundtrack of the lockdown. Sorry, I was on mute. I think everyone has worked that out except you. So thanks, Neil. I will just bring everyone through a bit of an update on where we've gotten to in the last week. And obviously, it's been a fairly tumultuous time on the Brexit front. I think after a period where, certainly at the start of lockdown and over the course of the summer, it fell away on people's agendas, both from a societal, personal and corporate point of view, but it's firmly back up there again. And I think it's probably fair to say for most businesses, it has leapt back up to the top of the agenda and has probably replaced COVID. Time is ticking. We are getting closer and closer towards the deadline. We are 107 days and about 12 hours or so away. My PowerPoint skills aren't good to make that countdown in real time, but if you're looking for any silver lining, it means that Christmas is about 100 days away, or maybe that's a bad thing as well, depending on your number of children. Time is short, and the reality is that 107 days is the point at which we get to a point where the British relationship with the EU is onto the new footing. The reality is that any deadlines really are about a month away, because any deals that will be agreed need to go to ratification, and that will take a period of time. This is a page which I actually pulled out from presentations I was using about a year and a half ago, which were trying to help people understand why the situation was so difficult to resolve. And I pulled it out because it's basically the chickens coming home to roost in terms of the last week. And it's a reminder of why we've ended up where we are, which is that the UK set out on this Brexit journey, not at the very start of the Brexit campaign, because if you go back to 2016, people were talking about soft Brexits, which included being in the single market or being in the customs union. But they very steadily and at different points quite quickly moved to a position where they removed some of those things, and a hard Brexit went from being one thing to being a completely different thing, and in this case it means no deal. But those three lines were that they need to be exiting the single market and the customs union, and there was no debate about those, that they wanted and needed a whole UK exit so that each of the four members of the union got treated the same, and that hard border was avoided in Ireland. And the reality is you can pick any two of those, and it can be any two you want, and you can formulate a deal using those two parameters. But once you add the third one, it's not deliverable. And the problem was that anything that was deliverable or achievable was something people didn't like, and anything people liked wasn't actually achievable. And that's where we've ended up now. And we're sort of back, as we have always been in terms of the key points of the negotiation, we're back to Northern Ireland. In a quirk of timing, I was actually in Fermanagh over the weekend and trying to escape before we got locked down here in Dublin. And I drove down this road here, which is in Balleek in County Fermanagh, on the way to Ballyshannon. And it just brought back to me again a couple of points, which I think are just worth reminding, even for us on this island who have an appreciation of what we're talking about. There's a couple of points here. One is, you can see on the left there, there's a couple of signs for Balleek and Pettigo. They are Irish signs, right down to the bit of Gaeilge on them. Not 10 feet away, we have the start of the Northern Irish border marked by miles per hour speed limit. And things are so now intermingled almost that it's probably difficult to even define at what point do you cross the border. The second point is, you can see this area here where the garage is, where Circle K is. That was where the army checkpoint was. And just to the left of it was where the customs checkpoints were. And I drove through, you know, expecting to see some of that infrastructure still there, but having fallen into disrepair, and having spoken to my father, who was from this part of the world, he explained all that stuff had been demolished, which it hasn't in every part of every border crossing, but that's how far, you know, that transition and how much progress we've made. And I think, you know, seeing these types of crossings and seeing the intermingling of the two communities and the crossing over points, you know, this is something that is still not fully appreciated in London and I think in some parts of the political machinery on the UK side. And therefore, it's no surprise that we've ended up back in Northern Ireland. However, it's not for some of the reasons that have been promoted by some of the UK politicians on this. They have been saying, and now they've argued an awful lot of things about why this bill that's been introduced is doing what it's doing, and you can probably get to about 7 or 8 different reasons why they think that's required, each of which is not correct. One of those is this issue about blockading food or other goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland. And nowhere in that internal markets bill does that issue actually get addressed. So that is a complete red herring. The two issues that this is focused on, and this is, if anyone has seen the Ed Miliband videos last night of him skewering the PM, he captured this very succinctly. It is about goods moving from Northern Ireland to GB and whether that is subject to the unfettered access that was part of the language in the protocol. And they are trying to remove the requirement for export customs declarations. And the second part is about state aid. And that is about the fact that there is a provision in there which the EU have always been clear on what it meant, and I think the penny has only finally dropped with the other side, that there is a catch that given that Northern Irish firms are going to be operating effectively in the customs union of the EU, that there is provisions there to prevent any state aid issues for Northern Irish firms, but there is a sort of a drag along that if you are a group that has, you know, a GB operation with a Northern Irish branch or Northern Irish subsidiary, that the overall business gets caught by that. And I think that, in truth, is probably the real crux of all of this shenanigans over the internal markets bill, because state aid, amongst all of the other issues, is the issue that Number 10 and the sort of wider Brexit movement have sort of decided is the key issue over which they can reassert sovereignty and do whatever they want to do. And some of that comes from certain advisors within the British government. Some of it comes from long-held, you know, bridling against the sort of EU red tape. But it means that Northern Ireland, again, is the kind of battleground for it. And unfortunately, businesses in Northern Ireland are the ones who are going to suffer as this uncertainty continues to grow. So in terms of where we are in the overall Brexit timeline, we have been, you know, 31st of January, Brexit got done, which was delivering on the election promise. Despite that, there was one MP last night in the Commons, if anyone saw it, who said that one of the reasons for this bill was to get Brexit done, but she may not have realised that Brexit got done on 31st of January. And over the course of the summer, so the yellow box here, we have had the period of negotiations. And we're now most of the way through that, and not enough has been achieved to get to a point where we have a deal that will be able to be concluded. And obviously the last week has put paid to that. And over the course of September and late August, the rhetoric and the commentary from the lead negotiators in particular has gotten more and more strident. And one EU source who was quoted as having said, we have wasted the whole summer. We have a UK cabinet who don't understand how negotiations work. We have a prime minister who doesn't understand it either, and he's under the impression he can pull off negotiating at the 11th hour. And I think some of this brinksmanship is part of that. It was initially maybe some attempt to do a bit of saber rattling, and I think they have probably misjudged the overall mood in Brussels and in Dublin and across the European capitals as well. The right-hand side of this, you can see I mentioned, really it's the 15th of October when any deal needs to go to the European Council for ratification. From there, it goes on to national parliaments if the deal is something that carries mixed competencies, which is what national parliaments get to have a say over. And that by the end of November, basically it has to go to Parliament for ratification on the EU side. On that timeline as well, it's worth mentioning there is deadlines on the UK side, so they have an awful lot of legislation that they need to pass, deal or no deal, that is going to be quite challenging because of the volume of legislation that they want to get through before the transition period ends. I mean, very briefly on the current status of the negotiations, it's not going to be a surprise to say that they're ongoing, but they're not really achieving very much. The reality is probably that both negotiators have reached the outer limits of the parameters that they've been allowed to work within by their political leaders. And I have a couple of examples here of some of the language, which again, you can discern from that the declining levels of trust, which are hugely important in trade negotiations. Michel Barnier saying that we've been going backwards more than we go forwards, and David Frost saying that the EU is just making this unnecessarily difficult, which is kind of harking back to some of the commentary from different Brexiteers that, a trade deal is only going to take about half an hour and then we'll go and have a pint to celebrate it, which was obviously all very naive. The end of the transition period. So what are we actually looking at right now? So starting at the right of the page and working back, because we can remove things, there is zero chance at this point of a comprehensive free trade agreement. And that is because it covers too many areas and it would be required to get into too much depth to enable it in the time that's left. And the last week has reduced that from sort of 1% to 0%. And that's largely because of the lack of trust now and the sort of view that Brussels will have of London that they can't be a reliable partner in negotiations, even if the will was there. So that leaves some sort of basic free trade agreement, which our current, I won't say calculations, but deliberations would say is about a 35% probability, which unfortunately leaves a 65% probability of no deal. So just to sort of explore that a little bit more, like there's two consequences from that. One is that the probability of no deal is really worryingly high. And it means that the default planning scenario for most businesses should be for a no deal. And if we end up with a deal, you are potentially in a very slightly better position to be able to come back from. The other point is the reality of what a basic free trade agreement actually represents. A basic free trade agreement will probably only cover goods, so hard goods that are being traded cross-border, along an ambition of being zero quota and zero tariff. That would be quite significant, and particularly significant to those businesses who are trading goods, and that means importing or exporting anything with the UK. But it's more notable for what it doesn't include. So a basic free trade agreement will not include anything to do with services. And that's more relevant to UK businesses than to us here, but there will be some of your competitors, if you're services businesses who are operating in the UK, who may not be able to operate in the same way in Ireland. That could give you a service provision issue if they're a supplier of yours, or it could give you a competitive advantage if they now suddenly can't operate in France, for example. We have the issue of equivalence. So equivalence is this decision that the EU will give to say, we've looked at your regime or governance arrangements for this particular topic, and we deem them equivalent to ours, and therefore we'll give you access. They have granted temporary equivalence for financial services. That's not open-ended, and there has been no equivalence decision yet for data. A basic free trade agreement will not cover either of those, which means that for data in particular, because there's no temporary equivalence yet granted, if any business is sending data to the UK, that could be a breach of European data legislation. Immigration would be another one that's not covered by it. It's not that important for us relative to the EU because we've maintained the common travel area, but for mobility from EU countries to and from the UK, that means that the mobility provisions that people would aspire to in terms of visa-free travel and so on wouldn't exist. I could go on at the risk of depressing all of us about the areas that wouldn't be covered, but I hope that gives some flavor of the kinds of the outlook that we're now faced with, which is that even in the event we get a deal, we are looking at very, very significant disruption in the UK in particular, but even for a lot of Irish businesses. And an important part, and we'll come to this, is trying to work out what that impact will be for you. So what happens at the end of the transition period? So there will be additional regulatory requirements that will apply more to UK businesses than to us. But again, you need to understand what that means for you. If it's a supplier in the chemicals business, for example, or the chemical sector, all of those accreditations and certifications are changing. Will they be able to supply product to you in the way that they would have? sticking with that example, the stuff moves on, it's got to come cross border. Will it be subject to tariffs? What paperwork will come with importing those goods? Where does responsibility for those tariffs lie? And then the free movement of people is the other big piece that will change, but as I've mentioned, a lot of that won't be impacting us in Ireland as much as it will in Europe. So the Brexit Readiness Action Plan was published last week by the government. It's about 80 or 90 pages and it's surprisingly accessible, so I would encourage people to have a look at it. It sets out some helpful examples of where impacts will be felt. It sets out where the government is going to take action, and it points out where you as businesses can take action. The key point I've pulled out of it here, in my view, is that the status quo will not be maintained. So regardless of the outcome, which goes back to the points I've made there on the outcomes. On the other side, the Cabinet Office said some time ago that there is some policy easements put in place for potential no deal in the past that will not be reintroduced because businesses have had time to prepare. And I particularly, I feel for our colleagues and businesses in the UK who are being given this line by the Cabinet Office that you've had time to prepare, when the reality is they aren't aware still what they're preparing for. The only easement that has been put into place so far is around some of the tariff applications. From the 1st of January, certain goods will attract full level tariffs in the event of no deal, but then there is a phased introduction in March and June of other sectors. So for example, some of the agri type products and products that would carry additional regulatory checks like the SPS or veterinary checks. And that is to give some level of additional phase in time. So again, there's no simple answer to many businesses who are wondering what the tariffs will be depending on the outcome. Very quick summary of just the areas of debate still, and they've been somewhat overshadowed by the last week, but the level playing field, so preventing Singapore on Thames, as it's sometimes described, continues to be a really huge part of it. That is somewhat code for state aid and state aid rules. Fisheries continues to be a very, very significant sticking point, albeit I did note in one of the statements last week by Michel Barnier that we, the EU, had shown flexibility on certain areas, including role of Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, the governance arrangements, and fisheries. Now, it didn't get picked up, but it suggests to me that maybe there is some as yet unpublished or unleaked detail around fisheries that, pending the agreement of some of the state aid issues, could be the basis for an agreement. The UK continue to argue that there is precedent from Japan and Canada, that we should be able to just copy and paste large parts of this. Those are arguments that the EU don't have any particular truck with, because those are both trading partners who are significantly further away. They have different sectors that are important to them, and we have different sectors that are important to us. And it's not as simple as copying and pasting a trade deal. And then some of the other areas, things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So for those of you in professional services, that will be an issue, and more so for our colleagues in the UK. And then the equivalence and adequacy decisions, which I've touched on. I won't go through all this, but the only point I just want to make is that over the course of the summer, there actually has been some level of guidance. Not as much as people would like, but there has been some level of guidance published. And these are different areas that are available to you depending on the sector you're in and the areas of the UK or the EU that you may trade. That should be something that gives you details in terms of how you can prepare for things like changes at border, what sort of tariffs will apply. There's a lot of guidance there for the European Commission. They've issued readiness notices, which you can find relatively easy, which again are quite accessible, and they're done on a sectoral basis. So it's quite easy to work out what applies to you or what doesn't. So quick summary of sort of some of those Brexit impacts, so sort of just pulling this together. So at the border, there will be barriers, there will be customs compliance, and for the EU going to the UK, there will be immigration changes. And again, most of those will apply irregardless of any outcome. For goods specifically, and in terms of your supply chain, there will be customs declarations required. Some of those forms, they come with 50 and 60 data fields. You should be familiarizing yourself with what those forms look like. Can you produce the data that goes into it? How many forms would you need based on the volume of trade that you import or export to the UK? The impact on services, which I've mentioned, much more of an impact on the UK, but again, that could indirectly impact you through your either competitors or suppliers or customers. So behind border trade barriers, so this is, I mentioned the chemicals example is a good example. So what sort of regulatory processes and certifications are going to be there? Because largely the UK is trying to replicate existing EU standards. So things like REACH for chemicals is the one that's often quoted. The Northern Ireland Protocol. So our colleagues in the North are dealing with the potential double advantage or double millstone around the neck of having a foot in both markets. That will come with administrative requirements. It will come with complexities around VAT that they need to manage. And that's going to be a lot of work for them to try and work out over a very short period of time with a lot of uncertainty what to do. And then the WTO fallback, or as the UK now refer to it, an Australian style deal. There is no deal between Australia and the EU. They trade on WTO terms. But what will those tariffs be if there's a WTO deal? The UK global tariff regime was adjusted during the year to bring some of those into line with WTO, mostly some quite small changes. But again, that detail is there for you to work out what the detail of the impact is. So in terms of what businesses should be doing to prepare, this is a kind of a classic diagnosis approach, but understanding your current state of preparedness would be important. If you have previous plans from previous deadlines, both real and the ones we've blown past, you should be revisiting those to see what has changed, what additional detail is there. What can you plan to do in terms of making changes to any of those issues you've identified? That might be changes to your supply chain. It might be changes to your systems internally in terms of how you generate data for some of those forms. And then being clear, if you can, as we get up to a deadline or as we get up to the 31st of December, what are the changes you would make if further time allowed? Or if you were preparing for a worst case and then something slightly better was to happen, what changes would you make? You can use this sort of spectrum to try and think about where you are. Some businesses have taken the approach, which honestly in the past it's worked fine up to now, which is that it'll be grand on the night. That isn't going to work now because regardless, as I said, regardless of some of these outcomes, a lot of this is going to change on 31st of December. So you need to work out where you are on this spectrum. What sort of readiness are you? How much will some of these things cost to change? If you're going to get a customs agent to do some of this on your behalf, for example, have you identified someone? Do they have capacity to take you on? We don't have a lot of customs agents in the country because we haven't needed them up until now. Do you have plans that take into account how COVID-19 may impact that, and in particular trying to stress test if there was further issues in supply chains or in lockdowns, how those would be impacted? One thing to think about, and Neil has touched on some of the UK economic issues, is if there is a decline in the UK on top of the COVID issues, what does that mean for your supply chain? So if you have suppliers in the UK who are already under pressure, either in terms of keeping the supply chains running from where they procure product from, or financially they're under pressure, if they were to go bust, what would that mean for your supply chain? If they were to experience some of the product shortages that they found during COVID, what would that mean? If you overlay, the added difficulty of having trucks sitting in Dover or in Holyhead or in Pembroke for a couple of days, what does that mean for your supply chain? So thinking about your supply chain, not just from a product point of view, but from a resilience point of view, which of your customers may end up going bust owing you money? Which of your suppliers may end up going bust leaving you short of product? One response you could be thinking about is, do you change some of your payment terms? So you could accelerate some payment terms with one or two of your key suppliers in order to secure a place in their supply chain and ensure you maybe have guarantees or access to products. COVID has shown how some of those supply chains were quite brittle. So, this will only be further complexity for some of those. On the logistics side of it, you need to be very clear about where your products are coming from and how they get here. If they're coming from the EU, but they get shipped in a box from Rotterdam to Port of Waterford, no problem. If they get put on a truck and they go to Calais, Dover, Holyhead, Rosslare, that's going to be more difficult. We've seen last week, before the current issues blew up, that there was a report that from Tony Keneally and RTE that the UK are leaning on us in exchange for giving us better access to the land bridge if we will go to bat in Brussels on some of the issues of, so they're finally starting to realize how important the land bridge is to us, and they're starting to use it as maybe some leverage against us. So that land bridge, which is hugely important in terms of supply chains that run to very fine margins, we can't achieve the same shipping times from, Frankfurt to Waterford going through Cherbourg as we can going through Rosslare and the Channel. It's just not physically possible. There won't be additional ferries laid on. I was on the radio last week with Rona Murphy, who was calling for additional ferries to be laid on from Rosslare direct to Cherbourg or direct to Roscoff. They are unlikely to be brought in before the end of the year, so you can't rely on those sorts of things. The paperwork piece is can't be stressed enough. There will be paperwork required if you're shipping or importing from the UK. You need to be clear on what that paperwork is and what data is going to be needed to feed into it. If that's going to be prepared manually, how many people are you going to need to do it? Are they being diverted from other activities? If you can generate it automatically, do you have your systems in place to be able to create that data and feed it through to some of your other systems? On the finance side, again, as I've talked about things like payment terms, you need to make sure that you have enough headroom in facilities. If you have working capital facilities or other factoring arrangements, do you have scope to try and ramp up the availability of cash if you need to try and protect some of your supply chain, or potentially to take advantage of any short-term opportunities? So if a UK competitor is disrupted here, is there a void in the market that you'll be able to step into, but you might need working capital to build up a bit of stock or to take on some additional working capital to do that. So there's some practical things which hopefully are relatively tangible in terms of things you can be doing. As there is very little time left, it is important to start to concentrate on some of the very practical and tangible things that you can be doing. Don't worry too much about the politics or the strategy of what may be happening. As I pointed to, there's a lot of things that are going to be happening here on the 31st of December that will actually happen regardless of the outcome. And you should be planning on that basis, effectively planning for the worst and maybe hoping for a very slightly better outcome. So that's the end of my presentation. Brian, not sure if there's any questions people have submitted there that we might want to take.
Yeah, certainly. That was great, Neil and Simon. Thanks for that. Neil, certainly you pointed out some of the real benefits of being based in the southeast, and Simon, certainly some strategies there that companies should absolutely be thinking about as we get ever closer to that cutoff point for Brexit. We did receive a couple of questions. Look, we're not going to have time to get through every single one of them, so I might just pick a couple. The first one, Simon Coveney mentioned only yesterday that he was still optimistic about reaching a trade agreement. Is this a reasonable position, or could this optimism be detrimental to Ireland?
I would say it's reasonable for him to be expressing optimism. I'm not sure how well founded it is. I think after landing several fairly strong punches at the weekend, I think he's probably viewing it as being something that's more constructive to say something like that. I'm not sure him continuing to punch down will achieve very much. So I think it's reasonable for him to take that position, but I'm not sure I would share the level of optimism that he's maybe outwardly expressing. But I think that's his role, to try and create the conditions that a deal can be done in. And I think the reality is, at this stage, like as I alluded to, I think the chief negotiators have achieved as much as they can now from a technical perspective. We are now at the point where we were for the last year when we had the agreement in the Wirral between Boris and Leo. I think we're back to a point where we now need the political leaders to step in and get to some sort of agreement.
Okay. To play devil's advocate, are the UK trying to simply create a level playing field and be cost competitive in the EU with their current negotiation strategy?
It's something of an oxymoron, I think, because the very nature of a level playing field is about trying to make sure that the conditions you create for being competitive aren't ones that are unfair. So the examples that have been given in terms of the UK focus is that they want to create the next, they basically want to recreate Silicon Valley somewhere in the UK. If that's funded through low cost or very cheap borrowing through sovereign borrowing, that's going to be something that isn't fair in terms of competition in France or Slovakia or Waterford. And I think that, so that is exactly what the EU are trying to guard against. I mean, is it reasonable for them to try and create those conditions? It is actually. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for them to say that that's their policy and that's what they want to try and follow. What is more difficult to support is that they would want to have access to the single market effectively on the conditions that they have today, but then also retain the flexibility around some of the protections that come with access to that market. So, it's really that kind of caking and eating approach, which has underpinned most of their approach till now. But, on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with that approach, but you've got to recognize that you can't have it all.
Absolutely. The next one, I think this one is probably for Neil. How cautious is our next budget going to be? And can we trust our politicians to make the right choices to avoid another period of austerity, given the deficit being racked up?
Yeah, I mean, we can be critical of politicians very easily almost all of the time, but actually we have put together a set of incentives and initiatives here that probably couldn't have been imagined before this began. So you would suggest that if you think about it, politicians ultimately have to be elected, and austerity is simply unelectable at the moment. There is no platform in which you could say we need to constrain our spending in health services, for example. But having said that, they are very concerned about the level of pay in the public sector, the level of a number of projects looking funding, and the number of initiatives for the industries that have been very particularly disrupted. So I think you're going to see a fairly conservative with a small c budget in terms of still trying to provide some constraint whilst bringing forward more and continuing to commit to the capital spend. What I would say is that the tax numbers coming into the government have been a little bit better than I think even they expected, and certainly than I did. And that will give them a little bit of leeway. So again, for an area like the South East and Waterford, it's to continue to say this project solves the practical problems for the government. It can be delivered in the following time. We can get the permissions ready. We can deliver it. And by the way, it means that some of the costs that Waterford or the South East currently incur around supports and financial and worklessness would be minimised by this investment. So getting ahead of the queue means solving the practical problems, not saying our need is greater, but our ability to really deliver on this, get the project shovel ready, get the benefits coming through to Ireland as a family. That's really the angle on which you've got to take it. So I do think you're going to see constrained budgets. There's going to be a lot of demand, but I think playing on what your strengths are mean that perhaps the government will be a little bit more cash rich than we might have expected when this crisis went in full flow. And 100%, there isn't an electable austerity journey at the moment. Sinn Féin were incredibly close to coming into power. They have a very strong narrative around a alternative left of centre position, and that very much is in the mind of the current elected government, and that's very much speaking towards no future austerity journey. So I don't think you're going to be worrying about too much austerity in the budget in the autumn.
Okay, very good. Listen, unfortunately, I think we could spend another hour going through the questions we have, but I think unfortunately we're just about out of time. Before I pass it back to Gerald, I think it's important to see where we are today. I think it has definitely tested our resilience and that of everyone around us. But I think one thing is for certain, and that's that the year 2020 will be spoken about for a long time to come. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Gerald.
Thank you very much, Brian, and to Neil and Simon for your, I suppose, your insightful presentations. And we'd also like to thank all the people that participated and joined us today. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar on our own website. So it will be posted as of on our website as of tomorrow. Look, it's clear, Waterford Chamber, we're very much committed to our members and committed to the future development of Waterford. And I want to assure you that we'll be at the forefront of representing all the business community, as always. And we certainly welcome all your participation and engagement with us. In the Chamber, we're because of obviously the current situation, most of the team are working remotely. But we'd also, at this point, certainly in light of the recent numbers that are coming out of Waterford, the COVID numbers, we'd very much encourage every business to make every effort to adhere to the guidelines. And look, there has been a worrying increase in the numbers here in Waterford, so we must be vigilant and compliant to stop the spread. And above all, please be safe and stay well. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you very much.